On the Giza Plateau, in the shadow of the pyramids, lies a weather-beaten monument that has the body of a lion and the head of a man. Carved out of natural rock, there's no sure way to know how long it's been here.
After reviewing all the measurements, angles, and proportions, it's my conclusion that the Great Sphinx of Giza is not the same individual represented in the statue of the pharaoh Chephren.
Despite the controversy, independent investigators aren't surprised. John West has some daring theories of his own about the Sphinx, starting with its head.
Now you look at the head, you see that it's in much better condition than the body. Even though the head is cut of a much harder limestone, the difference between the condition of the head and the condition of the body is extreme. Perhaps even more important, the head is disproportionately small. Seen especially from the air, you see that the body of the Sphinx is long and flattened out, and the head almost looks like a pinhead stuck on the top of it. This, to us, is an indication that the head has been recarved. In other words, the head is not original to the Sphinx. At some point in its long history, the head was redone.
The investigators also think that the Giza Plateau is a map of the stars as they appeared in the skies in 10,500 BC. Graham Hancock explains.
Standing at Giza, the ancient astronomers faced an uninterrupted 360-degree horizon, which invited observations of the rising points of the sun and the stars. Another direction also drew their attention, the north-south line dividing the sky directly above their heads. And they observed the stars as they crossed this line. In 10,500 BC, when the three stars of Orion's belt crossed this line, they did so in a pattern that is exactly matched by the pattern of the three pyramids on the ground.
The Sphinx, they believe, is actually an astronomical marker of the vernal equinox, but not in 2500 BC when the Sphinx was supposedly built.
When the Sphinx is supposed to have been built, 2500 BC, the sun rose in the constellation of Taurus. It would have been utterly absurd for a pharaoh to have built an equinoctial marker in the form of a lion in that epoch. In fact, there's only one epoch when it would have been appropriate for the Sphinx to have been built in the form that it has. That was the age of Leo, beginning in the 11th millennium BC.
Every 2,000 years or so, a different constellation appears behind the sun and a new astrological age begins. The last time there was an age of Leo was 12,000 years ago. Robert Bovel explains.
At this special time in 10,500 BC, the sun would rise due east, directly in line with the Sphinx, at the rising of the constellation of Leo. Here comes the constellation of Leo breaking over the horizon. And here is the sun. So it's at this time, at the age of Leo, that the Sphinx would be gazing at its own image in the sky.
But if that isn't enough, there's more. Why is the Sphinx offset to the right of the main east-west axis of this pyramid, and why is that causeway sloping to the south of east? The ancient pyramid builders did nothing by chance. So what's the significance of this curious offset?
The computer has the answer. It shows us that this is the place where the sun would rise exactly in the direction of the causeway, 14 degrees to the right, in perfect alignment with the causeway. Now what do we have here? To the left is the constellation of Leo, and as we can see, it's half buried below the horizon, with its head and shoulders sticking out. And this is what they saw when they looked in the east, the sun rising along the direction of the causeway, and to the left, the Sphinx, half buried in the sand, with its head and shoulders sticking out of the sand, in the same way that the constellation of Leo would be seen rising over the horizon with its head and shoulders sticking over the horizon line.
The Sphinx and the pyramids link up to form a gigantic astronomical hologram of the skies above Egypt around the year 10,500 BC. In that epoch, and only in that epoch, the key celestial bodies are represented with faultless accuracy, viewed from every conceivable angle and direction. When we remember the uncanny precision with which the pyramid builders worked, it's impossible to ascribe such interlocking complexity to coincidence. What we have here is a massive and deliberate time marker for the epoch of 10,500 BC, almost 8,000 years before Egyptian civilization is supposed to have begun.
Other evidence supports that date, especially the erosion on the Sphinx. John West believes it was caused not by sand, but by water. He says the evidence was there all along.
Well, nobody was looking for it. It's a bit like if you're looking for potatoes, you can walk right through a field full of diamonds and see a lot of nasty, glittering stones. So the geology was simply taken for granted. Nobody looked for it, nobody found it. Undercut, in other words, you'd have the deepest erosion at the bottom, not at the top. And you also wouldn't get those deep fissures.
West's discovery raised many questions. In a debate, geologists sided with West. Egyptologists have offered few replies to his conclusions. Journalist Paul Roberts covered the controversy.
West is really an academic's worst nightmare, because here comes somebody way out of left field with a thoroughly well thought out, well presented, coherently described, beautifully written, full of data you can't refute, and it pulls the rug from beneath your feet. So how do they deal with it? They ignore it. They hope it'll go away. And it won't go away.
Repair work done on the Sphinx seems to lend credence to West's theory.
Here we're looking at a section of the earliest repairs. You see that some 2 to 3 feet of repair blocks were necessary in order to bring the Sphinx back to its original contours. We're told that these repairs were done within 300 years of the original carving of the Sphinx. Now the question arises, why would 3 feet of repairs be necessary over the course of just some 300 years? Egyptologists insist that the stone the Sphinx is carved from is of such poor quality that it weathered away 3 feet in just 300 years. This presents another problem. If the stone the Sphinx is carved from is of such poor quality, and the Sphinx was carved 4,500 years ago, it means that at the erosion rate of a foot a century, the Sphinx would have disappeared some 500 years ago. Well, it hasn't.
Even if the repairs were done because of water damage, a major question is still unanswered. When was there water in the desert? The answer is surprising. At the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago.
This was a time in the history of mankind when the Earth was passing through an unprecedented upheaval. A tremendous cataclysm was taking place in the Earth 12,500 years ago. This was the end of the last ice age. There had been 50 or 60,000 years of relatively stable conditions with millions of square miles of ice covering the northern hemisphere. And suddenly, for reasons that no scientist has yet fully fathomed out, all of this ice melted in a span of just 2,000 to 3,000 years.
The ice cap that covered northern Europe and America back then was 2 miles thick. The melting was sudden and widespread and created floods of biblical proportions. Egyptologist Fikra Hassan explains.
Egypt experienced major and dramatic changes at the end of the Ice Age, particularly about 10,500 BC, when very high, exceptionally high floods covered the floodplain and ended things both in the Delta and the Nile Valley in general.
West developed his theory.
I think the history of the Sphinx goes something like this. Long ago, before Egypt became desert, the Giza Plateau was a fertile savanna. At its very edge was a large outcrop of natural rock. An unknown group of sculptors, taking advantage of its prominent position, carved the rock into a giant face. May have been the face of a god or of a lion. Time passed. Shifting weather patterns brought torrential rain to the area. signaling the end of the Ice Age. The rains weathered the lion to virtually the shape we see today. When the rain stopped, the once fertile savanna turned into Sahara Desert. The wind-blown sands buried the statue up to its neck for thousands of years, protecting the body and its telltale traces of water weathering. But what about the face? Still eroding away, diminishing in size. Possibly it was recarved. Certainly the 4th dynasty kings who built the pyramids around 2500 BC uncovered the Sphinx and further fashioned the face in their image. Pharaoh Khephren didn't build the Sphinx, he restored it.
Proof of their theories, West and his fellow investigators point to another structure they believe could date to 10,000 BC. It too shows unmistakable signs of being weathered by vast amounts of water. It's the Osiren at Abydos. It was found early in the 20th century, buried under sand.
Here, some 500 miles south of Giza, at the Osirion, we find ourselves amidst another of those enigmatic, anonymous structures that seem to date to no known epoch. 50 feet or more below the floor of surrounding pharaonic temples. Is it possible that this is just one amongst many structures like this buried beneath the sands of Egypt? Later pharaohs came and added their reliefs to these walls, but originally this structure was anonymous and bare, left for future generations to interpret.
Those who hold unorthodox views about the Giza Plateau find further confirmation in the Egyptian creation myth, what the ancients called the first time. Bauval explains.
Every civilization refers to a creation myth, a beginning. But the Egyptians were extremely clear about what had happened in the beginning. They tell us the earth was totally covered with water, and that the physical, the material earth sprang out of the water, and we had a primeval mound on which creation began, on which there was the first dawn, the first sunrise. It's as if, for example, the king who built those pyramids was reenacting that moment, that time of the gods. It would be normal for them to want to commemorate it, to freeze it, if you like, in a grandiose expression. I think if there is the original primeval mound, that's it, Giza. Indeed, the texts refer to the place.
The alternative view, think of what we're stuck with. We have a antediluvian civilization, and then you have nothing. You have nothing for how long? 1,000 years, 2,000 years? And then it starts up again. Where's the link?
Where is the other evidence of this culture? Show me a pot shard, show me a tomb, show me an inscription, show me any other piece of sculpture, show me any archaeological site that dates to this period.
That's like telling Magellan, after he'd sailed around the world, that the world is still flat, because where are the other guys who've sailed around it? What's at issue here is the entire history of civilization. It may not have gone in a straight line from stupid old cavemen to smart old us with our hydrogen bombs and our striped toothpaste.